If you look at my CAT scans, there are approximately 10 tumors in my liver, and the doctors told me 3 to 6 months of good health left. That was a month ago, so you can do the math. That is what it is. We can't change it, and we just have to decide how we're going to respond to that. We cannot change the cards we are dealt, just how we play the hand. I assure you, I am not in denial. It's not like I'm not aware of what's going on. My family, my 3 kids, my wife, we just decamped. We bought a lovely house in Chesapeake, Virginia, near Norfolk. And we're doing that because that's a better place for the family to be down the road. I, like Moses, get to see the promised land, but I won't get to set foot in it. And that's okay, because I can see it. And the vision is clear. All right, so what we're not talking about today, we're not talking about cancer, because I've spent a lot of time talking about that, and I'm really not interested. If you have any herbal supplements or remedies, please stay away from me. And we're not going to talk about things that are even more important than achieving your childhood dreams. We're not going to talk about my wife, we're not talking about my kids, because I'm good, but I'm not good enough to talk about that without tearing up. All right, so what is today's talk about then? It's about my childhood dreams and how I've achieved them. I've been very fortunate that way. How I believe I've been able to enable the dreams, of others. And to some degree, lessons learned. I'm a professor, there should be some lessons learned. And how you can use the stuff you hear today to achieve your dreams or enable the dreams of others. And as you get older, you may find that enabling the dreams of others thing is even more fun. All right, let's talk about football. My dream was to play in the National Football League. I did not make it to the National Football League, but I probably got more from that dream and not accomplishing it than I got from any of the ones that I did accomplish. I had a coach. I signed up when I was 9 years old. I was the smallest kid in the league by far. And I had a coach, Jim Graham, who was 6'4". He had played linebacker at Penn State. He was just this hulk of a guy, and he was old school. Okay, I mean really old school. Like he thought the forward pass was a trick play. And he showed up for practice the first day, and you know, this big hulking guy, we were all scared to death of him, and he hadn't brought any footballs. How are we going to have practice without any footballs? And one of the other kids said, "Excuse me, Coach, but there's no football." And Coach Graham said, "Right, how many men are on a football field at a time?" Somebody said, 11 on a team, 22. And Coach Graham said, "All right, and how many people are touching the football at any given time?" "Well, one of them." And he said, "Right, so we're going to work on what those other 21 guys are doing." And that's a really good story because it's all about fundamentals. Fundamentals, fundamentals, fundamentals. You've got to get the fundamentals down because otherwise the fancy stuff isn't going to work. And the other Jim Graham story I have is there was one practice where he just rode me, all practice. Just, you're doing this wrong, go back and do it again, you owe me, you're doing push-ups after practice. And when it was all over, one of the other assistant coaches came over and said, "Yeah, Coach Graham rode you pretty hard, didn't he?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "That's a good thing." He said, "When you're screwing up and nobody's saying anything to you anymore, that means they gave up." And that's a lesson that stuck with me my whole life, is that when you see yourself doing something badly and nobody's bothering to tell you anymore, that's a very bad place to be. Your critics are your ones telling you they still love you and care. One of the expressions I learned in electronic arts, which I love, which pertains to this, is experience is what you get when you didn't get what you wanted. And I think that's absolutely lovely. And the other thing about football is we send our kids out to play football or soccer or swimming or whatever it is. And it's the first example of what I'm going to call a head fake or indirect learning. We actually don't want our kids to learn football. I mean, yeah, it's really nice that I have a wonderful three-point stance and that I know how to do a chop block and all this kind of stuff. But we send our kids out to learn much more important things: teamwork, sportsmanship, perseverance, et cetera, et cetera. And these kinds of head fake learnings are absolutely important. And you should keep your eye out for them because they're everywhere. All right, my next one, being an Imagineer. This was the hard one. When I was a kid, I was 8 years old, and our family took a trip cross-country to see Disneyland. And if you've ever seen the movie National Lampoon's Vacation, it was a lot like that. There's a quest. And I just thought this was just the coolest environment I'd ever been in. And instead of saying, "Gee, I want to experience this," I said, "I want to make stuff like this." And so I bided my time, and then I graduated with my PhD from Carnegie Mellon, thinking that meant me infinitely qualified to do anything. And I dashed off my letters of application to Walt Disney Imagineering, and they sent me some of the damn nicest go-to-hell letters I've ever gotten. I mean, it was just
We have carefully reviewed your application, and presently we do not have any positions available which require your particular qualifications. Now think about the fact that you're getting this from a place that's famous for guys who sweep the street, right? So that was a bit of a setback. But remember, the brick walls are there for a reason, right? The brick walls are not there to keep us out. The brick walls are there to give us a chance to show how badly we want something. Because the brick walls are there to stop the people who don't want it badly enough. They're there to stop the other people. All right, fast forward to 1991. We did a system back at the University of Virginia called Virtual Reality on $5 a day. Just one of those unbelievable, spectacular things. I was so scared back in those days as a junior academic. And a similar story is that this was just this unbelievable hit because at the time everybody needed $500,000 to do virtual reality and everybody felt frustrated. And we literally hacked together a system for about $5,000 in parts and made a working VR system. And people were just like, oh my God, it's like, you know, the Hewlett-Packard Garage thing. This is so awesome. And so I'm giving this talk and the room has just gone wild. And during the Q&A, a guy named Tom Furness, who was one of the big names in virtual reality at the time, he goes up to the microphone and he introduces himself. And I didn't know what he looked like, but I sure as hell knew the name. And he asked a question. And I was like, I'm sorry, did you say you're Tom Furness? And he said, yes. I said, then I would love to answer your question, but first, will you have lunch with me tomorrow? and there's a lot in that little moment, right? There's a lot of humility, but also asking a person where he can't possibly say no. And so Imagineering, a couple of years later, was working on a virtual reality project. This was top secret. They were denying the existence of a virtual reality attraction after the time that the publicity department was running the TV commercials. Okay, so Imagineering really had nailed this one tight. And it was the Aladdin attraction where you would fly a magic carpet. And the head-mounted display, sometimes known as Gator Vision. And so I had an in. As soon as the project had just, you know, they started running the TV commercials. And I had been asked to brief the Secretary of Defense on the state of virtual reality. Okay, Fred Brooks and I had been asked to brief the Secretary of Defense. And that gave me an excuse. So I called them up, I called up Imagineering, and I said, look, I'm briefing the Secretary of Defense. I'd like some materials on what you have, because it's one of the best VR systems in the world. And they kind of pushed back, and I said, look, is all this patriotism stuff in the parks a farce? And they're like, okay. They said, but the PR department doesn't this is so new, the PR department doesn't have any footage for you, so I'm going to have to connect you straight through to the team who did the work. Jackpot. Right? So I find myself on the phone with a guy named John Snotty, who is one of the most impressive guys I have ever met. And he was the guy running this team, and it's not surprising they had done impressive things. And so he sent me some stuff. We talked briefly, he sent me some stuff, and I said, hey, I'm going to be out in the area for a conference shortly. Would you like to get together and have lunch? Translation, I'm going to lie to you and say that I have an excuse to be in the area so I don't look too anxious. But I would go to Neptune to have lunch with you. And so John said, sure. And I spent something like 80 hours talking with all the VR experts in the world, saying, if you had access to this one unbelievable project, what would you ask? And then I compiled all of that, and I had to memorize it, which anybody who knows me knows that I have no memory at all, because I couldn't go in looking like a dweeb with, you know, hi, question 72, right? So I went in, and this was like a 2-hour lunch, and John must have thought he was talking to, you know, some phenomenal person, because all I was doing was channeling Fred Brooks and Ivan Sutherland and Andy Van Damme and people like that, and Henry Fuchs. So it's pretty easy to be smart when you're parroting smart people. And at the end of the lunch with John, I sort of, as we say in the business, made the ask. And I said, you know, I have a sabbatical coming up. And so I talked to him about the possibility of coming there and working with him. And he said, well, that's really good, except, you know, you're in the business of telling people stuff, and we're in the business of keeping secrets. Right? And then what made John Snotty was he said, but we'll work it out. Right? Which I really loved. The other thing that I learned from John Snotty, I could do easily an hour-long talk just on what have I learned from John Snotty. Wait long enough and people will surprise and impress you. He said, when you're pissed off at somebody and you're angry at them, you just haven't given them enough time. Just give them a little more time and they'll almost always impress you. And that really stuck with me. I think he's absolutely right on that one. So To make a long story short, we negotiated a legal contract. It was going to be the first, some people refer to it as the first and last paper ever published by Imagineering. But the deal was I go, I provide my own funding, I go for 6 months, I work with a project, we publish a paper. And then we meet our villain. I can't be all sweetness and light because I have no credibility. Somebody's head's going to go on a stick. Turns out that the person who gets his head on the stick is a dean back at the University of Virginia. His name is not important. Let's call him Dean Wormer. And Dean Wormer has a meeting with me where I say I want to do this sabbatical thing, and I've actually gotten the Imagineering guys to let an academic in, which is insane. I mean, if John hadn't gone nuts, this would never have been a possibility. This is a very secretive organization. And Dean Wormer looks at the paperwork and he says, well, it says they're going to own your intellectual property. And I said, yeah, we got the agreement to publish the paper. There is no other IP. I don't do patentable stuff. And he says, yeah, but you might. So deal's off, and just get him to change that little clause there. And then come back to me. I'm like, excuse me? And then I said to him, I want you to understand how important this is. If we can't work this out, I'm going to take an unpaid leave of absence, and I'm just going to go there, and I'm going to do this thing. And he said, hey, you know, I might not even let you do that. I mean, you've got the IP in your head already, and maybe they're going to suck it out of you, so that's not going to fly either. It's very important to know when you're in a pissing match. And it's very important to get out of it as quickly as possible. So I said to him, well, let's back off on this. Do we think this is a good idea at all? He said, I have no idea if this is a good idea, you know. I was like, okay, well, we've got common ground there. Then I said, well, is this really your call? Isn't this the call of the Dean of Sponsored Research, if it's an IP issue? And he said, yeah, that's true. I said, so if he's happy, you're happy? Yeah, then I'd be fine. Like Wile E. Coyote, a little. And I find myself in Gene Block's office, who's the most fantastic man in the world. And I start talking to Gene Block, and I say, let's start at the high level, since I don't want to have to back out again. So let's start at the high level. Do you think this is a good idea? He said, well, if you're asking me if it's a good idea, I don't have very much information. All I know is that one of my star faculty members is in my office, and he's really excited, so tell me more. Here's a lesson for everybody in administration. They both said the same thing. But think about how they said it. There are both ways of saying I don't know, but boy, there's a good way and a bad way. I loved Imagineering. It was just a spectacular place. Just spectacular. Everything that I had dreamed. I love the model shop. People crawling around on things the size of this room that are just big physical models. It was just an incredible place to walk around and be inspired. I'm always reminded of when I went there and people said, do you think the expectations are too high? And I said, you ever see the movie Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, where Gene Wilder says to the little boy Charlie, he's about to give him the chocolate factory, he says, well, Charlie, did anybody ever tell you the story of the little boy who suddenly got everything he ever wanted? Charlie's eyes get like saucers and he says, no, what happened to him? Gene Wilder says, he lived happily ever after.